Every band has what you might call an X factor. For some, it's the singer, for some, it's the songwriter, for some, it's the guitarist. And with the band Rush, the question comes up again and again, did Neil Peart provide the X factor that made Rush stand out? And if so, does this mean that Rush might have actually been Neil Peart's band? Now, before you get your pitchforks out and come at me, let me say something up front. Rush was always three equal musicians working at an absurdly high level, but it's also fair to ask whether Neil's vision fundamentally reshaped what the band was and in fact enabled it to survive and made it possible for us to be sitting here still talking about Rush and getting ready for a Rush reunion even after he passed away decades later. So let's unpack all of this and figure out why Neil Peart was so fundamental to the band Rush. Now, the first thing to talk about is the fact that Neil Peart wasn't an original member, but the minute that he joined the band, everything changed. So the debut album from Rush was recorded with the drummer John Rutsey, and it's a really good hard rock album, very much speaking of its time and era, sounding a lot like bands like Cream or Led Zeppelin. Once Neil joined, there was a massive shift in Rush's sound and in Rush's approach. When Fly By Night came out in 1975, the drumming was precise, aggressive, and even more interesting, it became orchestral and narrative. This alone changed Rush's trajectory. But to go along with it, you now had lyrics that suddenly aimed toward different subjects like science fiction or philosophy or individuality, not things that you necessarily get from rock bands. The band kind of stopped sounding like Led Zeppelin or Cream and started sounding like Rush. And it's hard to think of another major band where the leap from the first album to the second album was that dramatic. It wasn't a gradual evolution, it was an instant redefining. One of the most unique things about Rush in classic rock isn't the odd time signatures that they played in or even their virtuosity. It's the lyrics. Neil Peart's writing stands completely alone in classic rock. He wasn't writing blues tropes, he wasn't writing teenage rebellion slogans. He wrote about things that most rock lyricists never even touch, including philosophy, nature, fantasy, science fiction, quests, interpersonal relationships, and of course, grief. But if you were to take Neil out of Rush and keep the music from some of their most important albums, what would you have? So let's think about the album 2112 without Neil's concept or lyric, or the album of Farewell to Kings. Take the song Xanadu and erase Neil's lyrics. What do you have left? You have a beautiful piece of instrumental music begging for an epic lyric. So the songs alone are ambitious, but it's the lyrics that make them really come to life. And Neil's lyrical voice gave Rush something that no other heavy or progressive band had, which was a sense of thoughtfulness and growth and a kind of search and discovery process that was going to continue from album to album, while the audience for the band was also growing up and maturing. Now, another element of all of this is the fact that Rush had a spokesperson for the band, and it wasn't Geddy Lee and it wasn't Alex Lifeson. It was actually Neil Peart. So even though he cultivated the shy person persona, he was actually the most articulate spokesperson for the band. And when you go through and listen to interviews, or read the liner notes, or read Neil's essay, or look at his drum-centered videos, he was articulating what his ideas were, what Rush was trying to do, and explaining the music in a way that even Geddy and Alex often didn't bother to. And that's not because they can't, but they themselves understood that Neil was a better spokesperson for the band. And this goes on from some of the earliest interviews. Well, you'll see the three of them somewhere, and an interviewer will ask them a question and they'll point to Neil to let him answer, as he was the band's interpreter. He was the one who helped listeners understand why Rush made the choices they did. Now here's what I think is the most vital point in this discussion, which is whether or not Rush would have even survived the 1970s without Neil Peart. Because hard rock burned out in the 1970s and prog rock collapsed under its own weight. Trends were shifting extremely violently, and you had MTV and VH1 and the 1980s synth sounds and all these changes happening right under Rush's feet. If they had had a different drummer or a different lyricist or a less forward-looking vision, there's a real chance they would have been remembered as a pretty good Canadian hard rock band from the 1970s. Instead, Neil Peart's vision helped Rush age and age gracefully in real time, along with their audience. So, was Rush actually Neil Peart's band? Well, here's my honest answer. Rush was never a solo project, it was never a hierarchy, but Neil Peart brought the conceptual framework, the philosophical backbone, and the long-term vision that allowed Rush to become more than just a technically impressive band. Without Geddy Lee's voice and bass, you don't have Rush. Without Alex Lifeson's harmonic imagination, you don't have Rush. But without Neil Peart's mind, Rush may never have endured at all. And maybe that's the real takeaway from this conversation. Not that Rush belonged to Neil or Alex or Geddy, but that the future of Rush was always in some ways in Neil Peart's hand. Of course, the most obvious thing to say now is the fact that we're going to find out what Rush is like without Neil Peart and whether or not it was his band. And the tour that's planned in 2026 will show us a little bit of that, with Annika Niles sitting in for Neil, but the tour is planned as a celebration of Neil. And this is smart because Neil Peart's presence, whether just in memory or in his drum parts, is the glue that holds the band together. If they try, and I think they will, to release new material without Neil and without Neil's lyrics, we'll see then the immediate impact of him being absent, whether or not his absence deals a fatal blow to Rush as a musical entity. So, let me know what you think. Was Neil Peart the center of Rush, or just the final piece of the jigsaw? Let me know in the comments below.
Music Guru here, asking you to help us on our march to 10,000 subscribers.